Except for the card mix, little has changed about Magic since Alpha. In Alpha, walls could attack, and losing all your lands of a particular color destroyed the associated spells in play, but otherwise, the rules are much the same now as they were in the early stages of playtesting.
Follow me on social networks. If you want the audio-only version or want a personalized video, find the links below.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone in between. Today I will be reading a book. I had a request a few weeks ago to read a book in a video, but since I didn't have one, I couldn't do it. The issue is, I did have one, I just forgot. I had this book, The Magic the Gathering Pocket Player's Guide, written in, or at least released in 1993, I think. It is written for the 1993 and 1994 cards. Released in 94 actually. And I've had this for about 8 years now. I got it along with a bunch of cards that are all from 93 and 94. And today we will be reading about the creation of Magic the Gathering, written by Richard Garfield, one of the lead designers for Magic the Gathering. It starts off, the ancestry of Magic. Games evolve. New ones take the most loved features of earlier games and add original characteristics. The creation of Magic the Gathering is a case in point. Though there are about a dozen games that have directly influenced Magic in one way or another, the game's most influential ancestor is a game for which I have no end of respect, Cosmic Encounter, originally published by Eon Products and re-released by Mayfair Games. In this game, participants play alien races striving to conquer a piece of the universe. Players can attempt their conquest alone or forge alliances with other aliens. There are nearly 50 alien races which can be played, each of which has a unique ability. The Amoeba, for example, has the power to ooze, giving it unlimited token movement. The Sniveler has the power to whine, allowing it to automatically catch up when behind. The best thing about Cosmic Encounter is precisely this limitless variety. I have played hundreds of times and still can be surprised at the interactions different combinations of aliens produce. Cosmic Encounter remains enjoyable because it is constantly new. Cosmic Encounter proved to be an interesting complement to my own design ideas. I had been mulling over a long-time idea of mine, a game which used a deck of cards whose composition changed between rounds. During the course of the game, the players would add cards and remove cards from the deck, so that when you played a new game, it would have an entirely different card mix. I remember playing marbles in elementary school, where each player had his own collection, from which he would trade and compete. I was also curious about Stratomatic Baseball, in which participants draft, field, and compete their own teams of baseball players whose abilities are based on real players' previous year's statistics. Intrigued by the structure of the game, I was irritated that the subject was one for which I had no patience. These thoughts were the essence of what eventually became Magic. My experiences with Cosmic Encounter and other games had inspired me to create a card game in 1982 called 5 Magics. 5 Magics was an attempt to distill the modularity of Cosmic Encounter down to just a card game. The nature of Cosmic Encounter seemed entirely appropriate for a magical card game, wild and not entirely predictable, but not completely unknown, like a set of forces you almost but don't quite understand. Over the next few years, 5 Magics went on to inspire entirely new magical card games among my friends. 10 years later, I was still designing games, and Mike Davis and I had come up with a board game called Robo Rally. Mike was acting as our agent, and among the companies he approached was a brand new gaming company called Wizards of the Coast. Things seemed to be going well, so that August, Mike and I made our way to Portland, Oregon, to meet over a pizza with Peter Atkinson and James Hayes of Wizards of the Coast. Both Peter and James were very receptive to Robo Rally, but informed me that they weren't really in a position to come out with a board game right now. This wasn't what I had come to hear, of course, but I didn't want the trip to be a total waste. I asked Peter what he would be interested in. Peter replied that he really saw the need for a game that could be played quickly with minimal equipment, a game that could go over well at conventions. Could I do it? Within a few days, the initial concept for a trading game was born. Trading card game, rather. Based on another card game I had developed in 1985 called Safecracker. It hadn't been one of my best games, but then I remembered 5 Magics. The first designs. I went back to graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania and worked on the card game in whatever spare time I had. It wasn't easy. There were 3 months of false starts on the project. There are so many aspects of card game design that have to be reconsidered when designing trading card games. First of all, you can't have any bad cards. People wouldn't want to play with them. In fact, you want to prevent too much range in the utility of cards because players will only play with the best. Why make cards people won't play with? Besides, homogeneity of card power is the only way to combat the rich kid syndrome that threatened the game concept from the start. What was to keep someone from going out and getting 10 decks and becoming unbeatable? It was a major design concern. I had numerous theories on how to prevent purchasing power from unbalancing the game, none of which were entirely valid, but all of which had a grain of truth. The most compelling counter to this buy out the store strategy was the ante. If we were playing for ante, the argument ran, and your deck was the distilled fruit of 10 decks. When I did win, I would win a more valuable card. Also, if the game had enough skill, then the player purchasing their power would surely be easy prey for the players dueling and trading their way to a good deck. And of course, there was a sentiment that buying a lot of poker chips doesn't make you a winner. In the end, however, the rich kid syndrome became less of a concern. Magic is a fun game, and it doesn't really matter how you get your deck. Playtesting showed that a deck that is too powerful defeats itself. On the one hand, people stopped playing against it. For anti-useless, a handicap was invoked. On the other, it inspired them to assemble more effective decks in response. The first Magic release was affectionately named Alpha. It consisted of 120 cards split randomly between 2 players. The 2 players would ante a card, fight a duel over the ante, and repeat until they got bored. They often took a long time to get bored. Even then, Magic was a surprisingly addictive game. About 10 o'clock one evening, Barry Bit Reich and I started a game in the University of Pennsylvania Astronomy Lounge, a windowless, air-conditioned room. We played continuously until about 3 a.m. At least, that's what we thought, until we left the building and found that the sun had risen. I knew then that I had a game structure that could support the concept of individually owned and tailored decks. Sorry. The game was quick, and while it had bluffing and strategy, it didn't seem to get bogged down with too much calculation. The various combinations that came up were enjoyable and often surprising. At the same time, the variety of card combinations didn't unbalance the game. When a person started to win, it didn't turn into a landslide. From Alpha to Gamma. Except for the card mix, little has changed about Magic since Alpha. In Alpha, walls could attack, and losing all your lands of a particular color destroyed the associated spells in play, but otherwise, the rules are much the same now as they were in the early stages of playtesting. Moving from Alpha to the beta version was like releasing a wild animal. The enjoyable game that was Alpha now burst the confines of the duel to invade the lives of participants. Players were free to trade cards between games and hunt down weaker players to challenge them to duels, while gamely facing or cravenly avoiding those who were more powerful. Reputations were forged, reputations built on anything from consistently strong play to a few lucky wins to good bluffing. The players didn't know the card mix, so they learned to stay on their toes during duels. Even the most alert players would occasionally meet with nasty surprises. This constant discovery of unknown realms in an uncharted world gave the game a feeling of infinite size and possibility. For the Gamma version, new cards were added, and many of the creature costs were increased. We also doubled the pool of playtesters, adding in a group with Stratomatic baseball experience. We were particularly anxious to find out if Magic could be adapted for league play. Gamma was also the first version which was fully illustrated. Scaff Elias was my art director. He and others spent days poring over old graphic magazines, comic books, and game books searching for art for the cards. These playtest decks were pretty attractive for crummy black and white cardstock photocopies. For the most part, the cards were illustrated with serious pictures, but there were a lot of humorous ones as well. Heel was illustrated by Scaff's foot. Power Sink showed Calvin, of Calvin and Hobbes, in a toilet. After all, what is a toilet but a power sink? Berserk was John Travolta dancing in Saturday Night Fever. Righteousness pictured Captain Kirk, and Blessing showed Spock doing his live long and prosper gesture. An old comic book an old comic book provided a Charles Atlas picture for holy strength, and a 98-pound weakling getting sand kicked in his face for weakness. In Still Energy was Richard Simmons. The infamous glasses of Urza were some X-ray glasses we found in a catalogue. Ruthie Kantorovitz constructed a darling flame-belching baby for fire-breathing. I myself had the honor of being the goblins. The pictures and additional players greatly added to the game atmosphere. It became clear that while duels were for 2 players, the more players playing, the better the game was. In some sense, the individual duels were part of a single larger game. Striking the balance. Each playtest set saw the expulsion of certain cards. One type of card was common in Alpha and Beta. In Alpha and Beta was rare in Gamma, and now non-existent. The type that made one of your rivals' cards yours. Yes, control magic used to permanently steal a creature from your opponent. Similarly, steal artifact really took an artifact. Copper Tablet no longer even remotely resembles its original purpose, which was to swap 2 creatures in play. Yes, I'll swap my merfolk for your dragon. On second thought, make that my goblins. They're uglier. There was a spell, Plane Shift, which stole a land, and Echo Shift, which collected all the lands, shuffled them, and redealt them. Really nice for the user of 4 or 5 colors of magic. Pixies used to be a real pain. If they hit you, you swapped a random card from your hand with your opponent. These cards added something to the game, often in the form of players trying to destroy their own creatures before their opponents took them for good, or even trying to take their own lives to preserve the last shreds of their decks. However, in the end, it was pretty clear that the nastiness this added to the game environment wasn't worth the trouble, and no card should ever be at risk unless players choose to play for anti. It was around this time I began to realize that almost any decision made about the game would be opposed, often vehemently, by some players. The huge amount of dissent about what should and should not be a part of the card mix has led players to make their own versions for playtesting, a significant task that involves designing, constructing, shuffling, and distributing about 4,000 cards. Each of these games has its merits, and the playtesters enjoyed discovering the quirks and secrets of each new environment. The results of these efforts will form the basis of future Deckmaster games that use the structure of the Gathering, while containing mostly new cards. To build a better deck. Playtesting a Deckmaster game is difficult. Probably the only games harder to playtest are elaborate multiplayer computer games. After developing a basic framework for Magic that seemed fairly robust, we had to decide which of the huge selection of cards to include, with what relative frequencies. Common cards had to be simple, but not necessarily less powerful than rare cards. If only rare cards were powerful, players would either have to be rich or lucky to get a decent deck. Sometimes a card was made rare because it was too powerful, or imbalancing in large quantities, but more often rare cards were cards that were intricate or specialized, spells you wouldn't want many of anyway. But these design guidelines only got us so far. The whole game's flavor could change if a handful of seemingly innocent cards were eliminated, or even made less or more common. When it came down to actually deciding what to include and what to do without, I began to feel like a chef obliged to cook a dish for 10,000 people using 300 ingredients. One thing I knew I wanted to see in the game was players using multicolor decks. It was clear that a player could avoid a lot of problems by stripping down to a single color. For this reason, many spells were included that paralyzed entire colors, like Karma, Elemental Blast, and the Circles of Protection. The original plan was to include cards that thwarted every obvious simple strategy, and, in time, to add new cards which would defeat the most current ploys and keep the strategic environment dynamic. For example, it was obvious that relying on too many big creatures made a player particularly vulnerable to the Meekstone, and a deck laden with fireballs and requiring lots of mana could be brought down with mana barbs. Unfortunately, this strategy and counter-strategy design led to players developing narrow decks and refusing to play people who used decks that would defeat them flat out. If players weren't compelled to play a variety of players and could choose their opponent every time, a narrow deck was pretty powerful. Therefore, another, less heavy-handed way to encourage variety was developed. We made it more difficult to get all the features a player needs in a deck by playing a single color. Gamma, for example, suffered from the fact that blue magic could stand alone. It was easily the most powerful magic, having two extremely insidious common spells, Ancestral Memory and Time Walk, both of which have been made rare. It had awesome counterspell capabilities. It had amazing creatures, two of the best of which are now uncommon. Blue magic now retains its counterspell capability, but is very creature poor and lacks a good way to direct damage. Red magic has little defense, particularly in the air, but has amazing direct damage and destruction capability. Green magic has an abundance of creatures and mana, but not much more. Black is the master of anti-creature magic and has some flexibility, but is poorly suited to stopping non-creature threats. White magic is the magic of protection, and the only magic with common banding, but has little damage-dealing capability. Sometimes, seemingly innocuous cards would combine into something truly frightening. A good part of playtest efforts was devoted to routing out the cards that contributed to so-called degenerate decks, the narrow, powerful decks that are difficult to beat and often boring to play with or against. Without a doubt, the most striking was Tom Fontaine's deck of Sooner Than Instant Death, which was renowned for being able to field upwards of 8 large creatures on the second or third turn. In the first Magic tournament, Dave Hurricane Petty walked to victory with his land destruction deck. Dave also designed a deck of specters, mind twists, and disrupting specters that was so gruesome I don't think anyone was ever really willing to play it. Scaff's deck, the Great White Death, could outlive just about anything put up against it. Charlie Caton's Weenie Madness was fairly effective at swamping the opponent with little creatures, though this deck was probably not in the high win bracket of the previous decks. It was recognized that playing for ante, Charlie could hardly lose. Even winning only 1 in 4 of his games, and he could usually do better than that, the card he won would be traded back for the island and the 2 merfolks he lost, with something extra thrown in. In the end, I decided that the degenerate decks were actually part of the fun. People would assemble them, play with them until they got bored. Oh, someone's sent me a message on Skype. Play with them until they got bored, or their regular opponents refused to play against them, and then retire the deck or trade off its components for something new. 2 seconds. It's just Mixed ASMR messaging me. Something new. A magic version of putting the champion out to stud. Most players ended up treating their degenerate decks much like role players treat their most successful characters. They were relegated to the background, to be occasionally dusted off for a new encounter. After the pursuit of sheer power died down, another type of deck developed, the weird theme deck. These decks were usually made to be as formidable as possible within the constraints of their theme. When Bit grew bored of his serpent deck, he had a predilection of flopping a rubber snake on the playing surface and going sss whenever he summoned a serpent. He played his artifact deck, which consisted of artifacts only, no land. It was fun to see artifact deck go up against someone who used Neveral's disc. But the king of weird decks was without a doubt Charlie Caton. In one league, he put together a deck that I call the Infinite Recursion deck. The idea was to set up a situation where his opponent couldn't attack him until Charlie could play swords to plowshares on a creature. Then he could play Time Twister, causing the cards in play to be shuffled with the graveyard, hand, and library to form a fresh library. Swords to Plowshares actually removes a creature from the game, so his rival has 1 less creature. Repeat. After enough iterations, his rival was bloated with life given by the Swords to Plowshares. Well, maybe 60 life points, there was no creatures left in his deck, so Charlie's elves started in 59 life, 58 life, 57 life, and the curtain closes on this sad game. I still can't think about this deck without moist emotional snorts. The coup de grace is that this league required players to compete their decks 10 times, and since his games often lasted over an hour and a half, he received at least 1 concession. Okay, I'll probably continue this at some point in the future. I think there's about 10 pages or so left, and I've read through about 10, so I think it makes sense to split this into 2 parts, because I gotta wake up in a few hours. So if you enjoyed this, you can leave a like, and if you disliked it, you can leave a dislike. If you want to check out my channel for more content, you're more than welcome to do that. And I hope this was relaxing and or interesting. So, yeah, I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye. in the presence of a decaying tree, or thrives on their warmth when the garden has turned grey, and the moon has ceased to be metaphorical in its shine.